welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. Just a little over a year ago, as 100,000 Russian troops were massing on the border with Ukraine, observers were split in their question, would he, wouldn't he? Would Vladimir Putin invade his peaceful neighbor to the south, or would he not? Key to that understanding was your estimate of Vladimir Putin's leadership and personality. Key to understanding leadership and personality is the field of political psychology. And to help us understand that, we're joined today by a member of the Texas National Security Review Editorial Board, a professor at Brown University, Rose McDermott. Rose, welcome, and if you take a moment just to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Doyle. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm Rose McDermott. I am a professor of political science at Brown University, and I am a political psychologist.
Probably the best place to start, because political psychology is one of those things where listeners may think, well, I know what politics is. I know what psychology is. Well, what is political psychology, and what analytical leverage does it offer us?
Political psychology has been around in some form or another for some number of years, but has never taken off as like a major subfield in either psychology or in political science. But it's really a combination of trying to take theories and methods and ideas from psychology and applying them to questions in political science. And sometimes that takes the form of looking at voting behavior in American politics, but it can also take the form of examining leaders in the case of Putin or Donald Trump or any other leader. It could also be, applying political lenses to psychological phenomenon, but that direction is much less common.
This sounds promising because, of course, political decisions are made by people. People are influenced by psychological factors as well as by biases, by interests. What are the limits of political psychology as a mode of analysis in trying to understand events, especially large events like the invasion of Ukraine?
I think that the big limit is that it focuses primarily on the individual level of analysis, meaning we're really looking at the individual. And obviously, in the case of what Putin is doing in Ukraine, that makes sense because he seems to have an outside influence on what his entire country is doing. But sometimes there are large structural factors that are related to big economic or social or demographic characteristics that may not necessarily be entirely encompassed into looking at just an individual level. And you can sometimes lose sight of those factors that, say, realists might be paying more attention to. It doesn't mean that you don't take them into consideration, but that's not your primary focus. And if the driving force behind, say, globalization or, technological innovation is really capturing a main part of what's explaining something, that won't necessarily always be front and center in a political psychology analysis.
So it's interesting because you mentioned the realists, which is a school of international relations that tends to focus on material determinants of power. Oftentimes that's contrasted with constructivism, which is the idea that every state, in fact, every person and leaders of states, have a mutually constituted image of the other state in their mind, and that helps to determine how they perceive interests, what actions that they undertake. And so it strikes to me that perhaps political psychology is closely related to constructivism. Is that fair?
I don't tend to think of it that way. And I mean, there are people who do, but I don't, for the following reason. I see constructivism as coming much more out of a sociological tradition that is more about the interaction between people. So my interaction with you and your interaction with me and how you and I create an us, and then we can talk about how we move forward in a particular kind of way. Whereas in political psychology, you're really looking at the individual. So it's the difference between a decision that someone might make in their own head. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't encompass their ideas of other people. But that's very different than, say, a game of strategic interaction where I'm actually analyzing what happens between us. And so I see it as a slightly different thing because it's more looking at the inside of somebody's head as opposed to the social and strategic interaction between individuals, which can come into play, but isn't the primary focus of attention.
That makes a lot of sense. Another school of analysis in international relations that is often contrasted with political psychology is the so-called rationalist school. And there are a number of prominent scholars. James Fearon is the one who comes to mind first for me and for, I think, many other political scientists. And rationality has a relatively limited definition here. It's the idea that actors have consistent ordered preferences. But it also brings to mind, and this does start to get into that sort of blend of political psychology and behavioral economics. There's a wonderful book by Daniel Ariely called Predictably Irrational, which discusses sort of the way in which these assumptions of rationality may not hold. Is that also within the gambit of political psychology, or how would you contrast those two schools?
Absolutely. I mean, that form of behavioral economics really overlaps a lot with the kind of social and cognitive psychology that was developed by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Amos Tversky was actually one of my dissertation advisors. And, they really started this kind of field of looking at the way that people make mistakes and how we can think about how those errors and cognitive distortions affect behavior. And the behavioral economics people really took that to heart and have done an enormous amount of work, a lot of experiments, taking those insights to look at the way in which people's actual behavior deviates from what you would expect in a classical rational choice analysis, to say that's really not how people behave. And, over the last 20, 30 years, behavioral economics has become a big section of economics. And there's a lot of overlap between the people who do that and the people who do the kind of social and cognitive psychology who examine these same kinds of errors and biases in people's decision making and how that affects behavior.
So in addition to the behavioral economists, there's also a school of political scientists that have taken a look at the way in which decision makers are influenced by examples from history. And there's also, again, some overlap here between historians and political scientists here. I can think of Ernst May. I can think of the book Analogies at War. And forgive me, I always butcher when I try to pronounce the author's name, but it's a terrific book. But he's at Oxford. So I'm curious, does this also fall into that realm, or is that something different in terms of the way in which leaders are looking for patterns and perhaps finding what it is that they believe they're looking for?
I think that it overlaps partially, but not completely. And by that, I mean, your point about analogies is the place where I see the overlap. So analogies are one of these ways in which our basic rules of thumb, what the social psychologists call heuristics, can influence the way that we approach a given problem now. And we use analogies from history, like the book you just mentioned, but also analogies from other domains in the particular moment in time, to try and give us insight into how we should behave in the future. Sometimes that's quite instructive. And you say, okay, this person is like Hitler. Let me do what I would do if I was trying to stop Hitler. And there may be ways in which that's similar, but the problem is there's always limits to those analogies, right? And so maybe the person isn't actually like Hitler. Maybe they're more like Mao or more like Stalin, or, there's ways in which responding to the way that you thought the other person could have been stopped isn't necessarily the right way to stop the person who reminds you of them. So there's limits to those analogies, but they're really easy, quick, effortless ways that we use to make sense of the world and to help predict what's going to happen and to generate responses, like how we should respond to a particular challenge or person or problem.
I had to smile when you brought up they're just like Hitler. Many of our listeners are probably familiar with the notion of Godwin's law, the idea that any debate on the internet will rapidly devolve into someone being compared to Hitler. And you just cracked me up when you said, well, it may not be Hitler. They might be Mao. They might be Stalin. And it strikes me that's perhaps not the defense that many of these people would seek out. I'm not Hitler. I'm Stalin.
Right. Or, I'm just a regular person. But, that brings you into this issue of a lot of these people who think that they're normal may actually have pretty severe personality disorders. And, of course, that isn't restricted to leaders. We all know people like that in academic faculty rooms, in businesses, in families. I mean, deviant behavior is not restricted to political leadership in any way, shape, or form. And
for an extra donation from listeners, we'll provide a list of those deviant personalities in the comments section on the podcast. But, we've discussed several scholars who have contributed significantly to the field of political psychology and adjacent fields. But we haven't yet mentioned a scholar who you and I were discussing with incredible warmth just before the podcast. And that, of course, is the late Robert Jervis. And, I think of his landmark 1976 book, Perception and Misperception in International Politics. And this laid out a number of really powerful and useful ways in which perceptions and misperceptions may occur. And, he had some categories. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of outline some of the major ones that we see in terms of attribution bias and things like that.
I was very fortunate to have Bob be my primary dissertation advisor. He was an amazing scholar, an even more amazing human being. And I think that in many ways, that book, The Perception and Misperception, I think of it as kind of the founding document of political psychology. I mean, there were aspects of it, certainly people who looked into leadership like Laswell before, but when you think about applying it to international relations, that's really the kind of founding document. And a lot of the recent work on, the behavioral turn in IR and stuff, I think really owes its founding to the work that Bob did. And what he tried to do was to take these ideas from psychology and apply them to these challenges and repeated problems in international relations. He did this in a number of ways. One of them was actually the point you just raised about analogies, right? Where I think chapter 6, if I recall off the top of my head, is how decision makers learn from history. And he talks about how they learn from history, but it's not random. They learn from history based on things like their first political experience. So their first political experience has an outside influence on how they think about the world. And I think that that's instructive with regard to Putin, right? So when you look at what I've read about him, one of his founding experiences had to be being in Berlin in 1989 when the wall fell. And the chaos that surrounded that was extremely disturbing to him and set a sort of foundation for the rest of the way that he came to understand his role in the world, but also the way that politics works. And the other thing that Bob said is you're really disproportionately influenced by your first big political success and or your first big political failure. So if it's a success, you want to keep doing the same thing and you think it'll always be a success. But if the surrounding environment changes, you may not be successful. And you're going to avoid the thing that was a failure when, in fact, maybe that thing in a different situation would lead to a success. But he also talked sequentially about these particular biases, not just in that book, but in other work that he did to say, take the work that Kahneman and Tversky did, for example, representativeness, which is this heuristic that says we judge the likelihood or probability of an event based on, how similar it is. And sometimes that's a reasonable way to judge, but lots of times it's not. But we over attribute things. And I think one of the continuing things he raised, and in fact was part of the last article he did for the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which was on intelligence and how intelligence can go wrong. And he had a long history of that, starting with doing the postmortem on the Iran crisis for the CIA in the late 70s. But that last piece talked about the confirmation bias and how what happens with the confirmation bias is we go looking for evidence that supports our pre-existing theories. So you have a theory that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and you go looking for evidence that that's true. You don't go looking for evidence that it's not true. And so what happens is that not only are you biased in your search for information, but you actually subject the information that you have to different standards. So in some cases, if the information you receive is consistent with your prior belief, you just accept it. You don't challenge it. You don't interrogate it. You don't say, gee, I need to find out if that's true. You just go, well, of course. But if the information you get is counter to your beliefs, then you subject it to all kinds of interrogation and investigation and exploration because you don't believe it's true. And we all do this in our lives all the time, but it can be particularly problematic when you think about intelligence analysis in the realm of national security policy. And it gets us into the kinds of trouble that you saw with the mistaken belief in weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There may have been other things going on. I believe there were political pressures. Bob did not believe there were political pressures. It was probably the only time I really disagreed with him. But, different people can take different perspectives on that. But the confirmation bias itself is an endemic problem that people need to be aware of so that they aren't subjecting different pieces of information to differing levels of skepticism based on their prior beliefs.
So this gets into a couple of really intriguing and sort of central questions in political sciences, generally and in international relations, particularly because we're talking about biases and processes that affect individuals in their decision making. And yet when we look at a decision like the decision to invade Iraq, or in fact, Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, that decision, while it has a strong role for an individual, is made by a bureaucracy or supported by a bureaucracy. And so that the two questions that come up here, one is the question of structure versus agency, which is, just a fancy way of asking, do people matter? Or is it the system that matters? But then the other is, okay, if people matter, how much do they matter when what I get is really the area under the curve of all the people who are involved in making this decision? If I've got to take the integral of all of these biases, do they cancel out? Or are there ways in which cultures start to enhance these biases in ways that can afford us analytical leverage?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think they also overlap. I think part of the issue is that when everybody has a bias that works in the same direction, it aggregates across individuals. It's not the statistical thing where the error is random and it cancels each other out. In fact, it can be more like the groupthink thing where everybody just exacerbates everybody else's belief until it eliminates doubt and it makes the belief more extreme. And this is also the place where our earlier conversation about, realist versus individual level of analysis comes into play, because I think what matters also depends on your regime type, right? So in a democratic system, you may end up with these kind of groupthink problems. And, it's not like it's perfect, but you have everybody on board with invading Iraq or whatever. I think the problem when you're in authoritarian systems is that particular leaders, particularly in personalist systems, have coercive power over their compatriots in a slightly different way, right? So just to pick the Stalin example, if you think you're going to get shot if you disagree, chances are you're going to agree. And when you have these kind of personalist leaders, one of the things that's really clear is that they tend to privilege loyalty over competence. So they're going to pick people that they know won't betray them, who will always be loyal to them. And those people may or may not actually have the skill set you need to be able to make sure that your nuclear weapons function properly, to make sure that your military plan for invasion of Ukraine actually works, to make sure that there actually are weapons of mass destruction, right? And so I do think that there are, for lack of a better term, cultural differences based on regime type. So under certain regimes, you get certain types of errors exacerbating in certain kinds of ways. And under other systems, you get these other problems. So in the chapter that I recently wrote for the Fragile Balance of Terror, the book that Scott Sagan and Vipin Narang put together, I talk about these personalist leadership styles and how, in addition to privileging loyalty over competence, one of the problems is they don't learn very well. Because if they get feedback they don't like, they can't learn from their own failures because nobody is willing to tell them that they failed. And they also can't learn well from other people's successes or failures because they don't think they're like other people. They think they're better than other people. There's this element of narcissism. There's this element often of psychopathy. And so they're not able to learn from their mistakes. And so they get replicated in a certain way, in a way that's much more difficult in a democracy where you can get thrown out of office, right? You can then try to get back into office, but, you can also get thrown out of office or put in jail or had other ways that you get decapitated short of actual annihilation.
Yeah, actual decapitation, which is always an option in some of these regimes.
Exactly.
It strikes me as we're discussing this, and it's appropriate that we are discussing Russian regimes. But the thing that came to mind was actually Tolstoy's opening line in Anna Karenina, right? That all happy families are the same, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way.
And I totally think that that's a lie, and I hate that book. I just hate that book. I think that book is one of the most god-awful books ever. I mean, I sat through that whole book being like, will you kill yourself already? Like, I just need to get rid of you. You were driving me crazy. Like, how can all these men love you? You're nuts. But that's an aside.
Wow.
Feel free to cut that
literary
out.
criticism is there. It's alive and well. But I guess where I was going with that, aside from the literary criticism, which is kind of fascinating because I had a similar response to Crime and Punishment, which made a lot more sense when I realized it had been written in serial form and he needed the continual source of income.
Oh, he needed the money.
Where I was going with that was really the notion that actually makes analysis of autocratic regimes really problematic. Because they are, as the name would suggest, personalistic. And so it starts to depend very much on what the particular pathologies of the leader are.
Absolutely.
And so I guess that takes us to the ongoing conflict today. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role of leadership in the war that we're seeing going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point because I think once you have a leader who's, personalist leader who has a lot of authoritarian control, then it does become a very idiosyncratic analysis, right? Like, I actually don't believe every happy family is similar. I think they're different, but unhappy people, unhappy leaders are different. And so, yes, there's common themes. A lot of them are narcissists. A lot of them are psychopaths, but there's also differences, both in the degree, but also in the kind of personality challenges, disorders that they may have. And with Putin, I see several things going on. I definitely see a healthy dose of narcissism. He definitely thinks that, I get the impression at least, that he really wants to conceive of himself as a later day Peter the Great, who's going to recreate this great Russian empire. And that's going to be his legacy and that's going to be his history. And that narcissism drives a lot of things. One of the most important of which is that you privilege yourself over other people. So you don't care how many people you kill. You don't care how many people you hurt. It's all about you. You don't care how many people you bring down with you as long as you survive in the way that you want to survive. But I see other things going on with him. Paul Slovic, who's a really wonderful, prominent psychologist, talks a lot about psychic numbing. And this notion is the notion that, like, when you have lots of deaths, it stops actually being able to penetrate your brain. So if there's the single Syrian boy lying on the beach dead, we all care about that, or the child in the well, or the kid in the balloon, whatever. And it's also always the thing that, like, people seem to care more about kids than other people, which also drives me crazy. I don't think that there's a moral differentiation, or there shouldn't be, but everybody seems to care more about kids. I think it's crazy, but whatever. And tens of thousands of people. So if you have 500,000 people die in the tsunami in Aceh, people are just like, I am going to give my money to, Sarah McLachlan and the ASCPA instead of, the people who are dying in Aceh. But one person really matters. And so I think what you see with Putin too is this incredible psychic numbing. Like, who cares if you throw 300,000 men at Ukraine and they all die or they all get injured? It doesn't matter to him how many people die. It just matters that he gets what he wants. And he's not getting what he wants, even with this massive mobilization.
Yeah, not to return to the Stalin example, but the quote that's been attributed to Stalin comes to mind, that the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million men is a statistic. And,
Absolutely.
This seems very apropos. And actually, I also was thinking of the article by Danielle Gilbert and Gael Rivard-Pesci on hostage diplomacy, and this idea of putting a human face onto something that may be happening at a large scale, but as soon as there's a single identifiable person along with it, whether that be the two Michaels in the case there with Canada and China, or more recently the Brittany Griner case. Now the suffering of that individual has a salience that this abstract many people doesn't.
And lots of companies take advantage of that bias to make money, right? Like, you adopt a child for, some organization, or you adopt a pet, or, you have a single person or individual that is supposed to evoke your empathy. And that hijacks, our evolutionary psychological architecture in a way that makes us care. But once you're past a certain number, it just loses all significance. And I think that you see that happening with Putin and the war in Ukraine.
But I also want to talk a little bit about Zelensky, because a lot of the Western reporting tends to treat him as a blank canvas. And yet it strikes me that there's a lot more there. And, so there's sort of the one story of this is Jon Stewart made good, but it strikes me that there's a lot more nuance and character and subtlety to what's going on there, and a great deal of skill in how he is managing his image and his leadership, both domestically and abroad.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the ways in which he's similar to, say, Jon Stewart is just that he's a phenomenal communicator. He can communicate in very effective ways. And it's not just what he says, but it's how he says it. He always wears that military gray hoodie, sweatshirt, t-shirt. It's always like, I'm part of the fight, right? Like, I'm not wearing a suit and tie. I'm in there as a warrior. He communicates all kinds of things physically with his body language. You notice he has very high dominant but accessible body language, which Vladimir Putin doesn't. He just has inaccessible body language, right? And he also has a wonderful way that he modulates his tone. And so I think that the way that Zelensky communicates and the skill he got out of being, say, a stand-up comedian is a big part of his communication. But that could be a shallow shell, right? The reason it's not is I think there's something else underneath it. And I think that something else is actually his personal history of having, of being Jewish, of having members of his family die in the Holocaust. He has a sense of vulnerability and a sense of history repeating itself and a strength of character that I think people didn't expect out of him. And also, he shows a kind of collective consciousness, right? He talks about his coalition of Ukrainians as a group that's together. One of the things that I loved about this recent Chris Rock schedule special was Ukraine is better off than the United States because it's united. And it's like, yes, that's true. His joke was like, if Russia invaded the United States, half of America would be like, let's give them, let's hear them out. And I think Zelensky's very good at creating the personal symbol around which all the actor expectations of Ukrainian democracy converge, right? Like, they all see him as the symbol that unites them, even though he wasn't particularly popular before the war, right? He had like 44% approval. I'm sure now he has like 99% approval.
Yeah, and that's a point I wanted to key on, is that, there's this perception that Ukraine, as Chris Rock said, is so much more unified. And yet, if you went back to Ukraine 2 years ago, a year before the Russian invasion, the bitterly divisive politics in Ukraine did in fact resemble the politics in the United States in many ways, in terms of the degree to which there was strong distrust among differing political factions. And while it's not a solution I would recommend for solving political division in the United States, there does seem to be a pattern that when confronted with particularly an existential threat in the form of an outside enemy, that differences can be papered over, but they do tend to also resurface out over time.
Absolutely. And that's what's so interesting about the United States. We've managed to divide ourselves in a way that no foreign adversary has ever been able to divide us. And I'm not saying that the Russians didn't help with the, disinformation campaign, but we've done it to ourselves.
So I'm curious, our listeners don't have the advantage I do of having the video as we're speaking. But when you spoke of Putin a little bit earlier, you made a gesture where you took your flat hand and passed it in front of your face and up. And it occurred to me that the phrase flat affect always comes to mind when I think of Vladimir Putin. I cannot think of any public image of Putin where he is experiencing any outward signs of an extreme emotion.
That's right. He never laughs. You don't see him, tear up. Not that a lot of leaders do that, but, you see it on occasion. You don't even see tremendous anger. You see, sort of determination, but not what you see as like uncontrolled rage.
So this strikes me as very different than sort of the particular stereotype of an autocratic leader. And certainly, again, I hate to invoke Hitler again, but, his speeches were impassioned. Not Howard Dean impassioned, but still impassioned. So, you have this sort of image of being able to stir. I mean, the whole idea of a demagogue is someone who can stir the emotions of the masses. Putin almost seems to lead as an anti-demagogue. Is that reasonable
I think he
or not?
doesn't care about stirring the masses. I think he, Hitler cared about having the people behind him. He wanted to stir the masses, at least toward anti-Semitism, if nothing else. But I mean, the Russians, traditionally have been, as a culture, kind of long suffering. They're willing to put up with a lot as long as the leader protects them from, external invasion and so on. I really don't think he cares about his population. I mean, and I say that in two ways. It's not just that he's throwing 300,000 men to their deaths without, the blink of an eye. But he's also lost what appears to be about 1 million young men who left the country because they didn't want to fight. And what's interesting about that is these are not the worst men leaving, right? They're the ones who have the education, the money, the wherewithal to leave. Most of them won't come back. And that's a very interesting thing to do in a country that's having a demographic collapse. I mean, they're like China. They just are not having babies, right? And so if you get rid of 1.5 million men in the space of a year, okay, it's not as bad as getting rid of 1.5 million women in terms of your reproductive capacity, but it's not great. And so he's actually having an intergenerational negative effect on his country, and he doesn't seem to care. And that's weird. But that's part of this kind of like flat affect is good. I think of it as kind of also, I think he has psychopathic tendencies where it's just really, he has no empathy, he has no sympathy, he doesn't care about what happens to other people. But it's also possible he's on some weird kinds of drugs, I don't know. I just don't think he cares. I think that other people's lives don't matter to him. What matters to him is his own life. But there are other authoritarian leaders who are like that, right, Doyle? I think Xi is he does not show emotion either. He seems very robotic to me.
This is actually, I'm glad you brought up Xi, because this is where I wanted to go next, is of course, while Putin and Zelensky are the two leaders with the most individual stake in the fight that's occurring, there are other international leaders, and Xi is certainly strong among them, as is President Biden. And then I would also put two leaders from Germany, obviously currently Olaf Scholz, but I don't think you can discuss it fully without also discussing
Absolutely.
The role of Angela Merkel, and in particular Merkel's relationship with Putin. So I'm curious your thoughts on how these leadership personalities interacted and how they may influence the course of what's going on today.
Yeah, obviously it's very difficult to know what the inside of these relationships are like. The one between Xi and Putin seems extremely transactional to me. It seems like it's really sort of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Obviously, China is going to be very concerned about its economic stability and its economic growth if it thinks that the Russian war in Ukraine that supporting the Russian war in Ukraine is going to somehow diminish their ability to continue trading with the West. I would imagine that would give them pause. I know at the Olympics, the two of them got up and said they were friends forever. But if that's their idea of friendship, I never want another friend as long as I live. Those guys are just, I don't think that, I think it was very transactional. I think Biden is really genuinely committed to his notion of the importance of democracy. I think he's done a really good job keeping the Western alliance together. If you just imagine the counterfactual, had Trump been president when Putin invaded, Ukraine would now be Russia, right? There's just, to my mind, there's no question that he would not have been able to hold the Western alliance together. And without that, it's very difficult to see a way that Ukraine could have survived the Russian onslaught. And so in that way, leadership matters, right? Individuals matter. I think Angela Merkel was an incredibly powerful and stable leader of Germany for a long time. It's been interesting to see the ways in which Scholz has differed from her and ways in which he's tried to, continue. For me, the most interesting aspect of the Putin-Xi thing is the ways in which Putin does, or the way in which she does or doesn't learn from the failures of the Russian invasion about whatever plans he has to take over Taiwan, right? So is it the case that they made some deal where Putin was like, I'm going to take over Ukraine, and she says, I'm going to take over Taiwan, and they both agreed to do this, and then she took one look at what happened the first couple of weeks in Ukraine and was like, this might be a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, and didn't do it? Or maybe he had never planned it. I mean, we don't know. But it's certainly instructive to think about it and to think about the way that those relationships can either egg each other on or restrain each other. And certainly if China stops buying oil from Russia, if they fail to supply the kinds of weapons they need, obviously India is still buying oil from Russia and they're getting their drones from Iran and stuff like that. But it would be a big constraint. And I think that's part of why the U.S. is trying to put pressure on China, saying your economic wherewithal is really going to be compromised if you do this thing. And you need to be aware that your economic trade with us is vastly greater than your economic trade with Russia. And so approaching it in a transactional way as well. Whether or not that's successful, I think we have to wait and see.
So I'm going to do the thing a podcast host should never do, and I'm going to disagree with my guest here briefly, because you said that if Donald Trump had been president, that Ukraine would be Russia.
I think so, but I'm not sure that's right.
I don't disagree with the premise. I don't disagree with the premise that Russia would not have encountered the difficulties in terms of the ability of Ukraine to fight based on Western aid. But I think one of the things that strikes me as interesting is, the United States, when we invaded Iraq and when we invaded Afghanistan, enjoyed much more immediate military success than Russia has enjoyed in Ukraine. And yet 20 years later, we were still there. And so the role of leadership in sustaining public commitment to a long war strikes me as something else that's important. And so as we take a look at where Ukraine is going in the second year of Russia's war there, how does leadership play out in terms of the ability to sustain that, not only in this initial phase of heavy fighting, but if, in fact, Russia starts to encounter combat success and is able to occupy more territory, how much of a difference does the leadership make in the ability to maintain the willingness of the society to keep bearing that cost? Because, it occurs to me that managed to wear down the ability of the Soviet Union, and Leonid Brezhnev was not famous for his compassion for his soldiers.
Right. No, it's a really, really important consideration. And, I may have been a little facile, and I didn't mean that the Ukrainian people wouldn't have wanted to fight. I just meant that without Western weapons and without Western aid, it would have been extremely difficult for them. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't have kept up a resistance the way that there was resistance in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also the way that the Ukrainians kept up resistance after the Second World War. Remember, they kept fighting both the Soviets and the Germans till 1947. These are tough people, and we have to respect their commitment to fighting for their sovereignty. And I do. I think it's incredibly inspiring and admirable. I think the role of leadership is really important, but there's two leaders here, right? It's not just Zelensky, it's also Putin. And Putin can decide to throw a lot of resources that might go to other aspects of society toward this war if he wants to, and he seems to want to, and not really care what it does to the economic stability of the wider society. Sanctions are starting to, I think, cause some localized problems in Russia. Whether or not that causes any political instability, I think, remains to be seen. I think that the role of leadership in Ukraine, and like we were just talking about with regard to Zelensky, really matters because it holds the society and the military together. One of the things that I've really noticed is the difference in the morale of the troops, right? If the reporting is correct, there's enormous commitment, creativity, devolution of decision-making power in the Ukrainian military that has been very effective. You don't see that on the Russian side. You see weapon systems that are old, they fall apart, they are being destroyed, they're not being replaced. Lots of men are being killed, lots of men are being injured. They put in new, conscripts without training. I if I see an end to the war that circumvents Putin, that's it, which is a collapse of the morale of the Russian military, akin to what you saw on the German side in the First World War, right? Because they actually did have more and better food and munitions, but they lost the will to fight. They turned around, and I mean, there was a lot more to it. I don't mean to oversimplify, but it was a big part of the story. And so when I think about how can this war be won by the Ukrainians without Putin giving in, it's basically the Russian military having a collapse of morale. And, you know, it seems to have come pretty close a couple of times. And it's interesting to me to see how that will happen when you get more of these kinds of conscripts who really don't want to fight.
Yeah, you know, the comment about the morale actually sparked a thought in me that, you know, there are two very different experiences going on in the same war. Is that Ukraine is creating a national founding story or refounding story, something that unifies and that plays a role in their history going forward that is likely to be akin to the role of World War II or something similar for the United
American
States.
Revolutionary War.
Sure. And you and I have discussed separately in relation to another piece that you were writing, the idea of moral injury. And it strikes me that, you know, much as political psychology takes the concepts of individual psychology and scales them up at times to the societal level, that we also see the idea that Russia is doing itself as a society a moral injury that is similarly going to have enduring effects. What those effects may be are difficult to project, but the United States didn't recover rapidly from Vietnam. The United States is still in the process of grappling with what it looks like to have been the state that engaged in a war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq.
Absolutely.
And those wars, though there are ample and legitimate critiques to be offered against them, pale in comparison to the arguments against morally, legally, prudentially, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so this really does present the challenge of how Russian society deals with the aftermath of this going forward. One of the things that I enjoy about TNSR and that I know you enjoy about TNSR is the idea that no one discipline has all the answers. And similarly, within the field of political science, no one sub-discipline has all the answers. And already in this discussion about political psychology, we've brought up the material aspects in terms of the provision of Western weapons, the economic effects of sanctions, all these sorts of things. So I guess sort of the question I'd like to the penultimate question would be, what role does political psychology play in deepening our understanding of what's going on and what's likely to occur in the war in Ukraine?
To me, it's about this leadership question. The individual psychology of the relevant leaders, how it plays out on their decision-making, how it affects their relevant societies, and how the relationships between the primary leaders lead to intransigency or compromise. And I don't think there's another field that can fully investigate that in quite the same way. Even just straight up psychology isn't going to necessarily understand all the political motives and incentive structures that are at play in a war. And so I think that piece is essential, particularly when one or more of the players is an authoritarian kind of personalist sort of leader. That provides important insight. It may not be the only thing that matters, but I think it's a decisive thing that matters.
So we are just about at the conclusion of the time that we have. And so I would ask if you have any concluding thoughts that you'd like to leave with our listeners from this discussion or areas that we didn't get to.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, and this sort of comes out of, to go back to Bob Jervis, the notion about being able to do some perspective taking, to look at things not just from your own perspective, but from the other side's perspective. I think part of the challenge is that in these conflicts, each side thinks that they're virtuous. Each side justifies the violence that they have as protecting their own people, society, religion, culture, X, Y, and Z from this horrible thing that the other side is doing. And it's very difficult when both sides construct themselves as engaging in what Paul Slovic would call virtuous violence, and Alan Fiske's notion too, that it's very difficult to get people off their moral high horse. And we may think that what they're doing is immoral, but if they think that what they're doing is moral, it may keep them at it a lot longer than we might otherwise expect.
That is almost as cheerful a concluding thought as the title of the volume that you've contributed to about the fragile balance of terror. I assume that's just the sort of thing you read to put yourself into a nice at ease frame of mind before going to bed at night. So that volume's Scott Sagan and Vipin Narang. And is that out already, or is that coming out shortly?
Yep, it's out already, and it's the American Academy of Arts and Sciences sponsored it, but it's also the Stanford Center for International Security and Arms Control. And there's a number of different contributors to the volume that they have edited.
Well, Rose, I've really enjoyed this discussion. We've been joined today by Professor Rose McDermott of Brown University to discuss the role of leadership and political psychology, not only in the war in Ukraine, but also in international relations more broadly. And I know I've learned a lot and found it fascinating. And thank you so much for joining us.
I've really enjoyed talking to you, Doyle. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.